Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm John Barron. Coming up, the government fast-tracking the abolition of a trucking tribunal despite concerns it could cost lives. Will the banks launch a mining-style tax campaign against a Finance Royal Commission, and would it work? And is it time to ban people from climbing on Uluru? And joining us on the panel tonight, Rendezvous editor and columnist with the Daily Telegraph, Sarah Lemarquand, the Deputy Director of the Sydney Institute, Anne Henderson. Joining us from Melbourne, the Editor-at-Large at Mamamia, Jamila Rizvi. And joining us from the Gold Coast, advertising guru Toby Ralph. And you can join in as well on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, first this evening, the federal government has fast-tracked its plan to scrap the trucking industry tribunal that sets pay rates. After saying on the weekend that the government would abolish the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal after the election, the Prime Minister announced today that legislation to abolish it will be introduced in Parliament next week. Owner-operator truck drivers say that a ruling from the tribunal lifting their minimum pay rates will force them out of business because bigger companies won't be subject to the same change. But unions and Labor say this tribunal saves lives in an industry that already tops workplace fatalities.
I run a small business with a handful of trucks. I employ drivers, but I also drive a truck myself. At the moment, I have the uncertainty of when I drive the truck, I am under a different set of rules to when I put one of my drivers in the trucks. We're already a very regulated industry, and I believe we're very good at what we do. We operate safely. Safety is paramount with us.
These people work hard enough as it is. They don't need the added grief. And this grief is because ultimately the legislation is stacked so only a certain group can use it. And unsurprisingly, it helps the unions out. And good luck to the unions and God bless them. But why put these other people out of a job?
So if an independent tribunal decides that it wants to defend penalty rates, if it wants to introduce shift loadings or proper casual payments, well, Mr Turnbull now, using the precedent of scrapping one wages tribunal, extend this view into scrapping other independent tribunals. Mr Turnbull should sit down with the industry rather than playing politics with safety on our roads and the pay rates of low-paid owner drivers.
So, Jamila, in Melbourne, what do you make of this? It almost seems on the face of it counterintuitive that we've got truck drivers not wanting a minimum pay. They want to be able to be paid less to do the same work.
That's right. You've got the unusual situation here where you've got remuneration being used as a lever here to achieve outcomes that aren't just about fair wages. You're also looking at safety in this industry. And for me, that has to be at the top of sort of our list of priorities in this area. If we've got 25 people, I think it is a month, dying in truck-related accidents, that has got to be top of our agenda, which is keeping them safe. And maybe the mechanism to do that is through wages, but there are other mechanisms we can be using as well in terms of putting requirements on mechanics and fixing up these trucks. But we've got to accept that the pressure on a lot of these drivers is huge to keep driving, keep pushing their bodies well beyond what they're capable of, which is what leads to accidents.
And what do you make of that argument, which I guess comes down to a bit of a kind of save these truck drivers from themselves, these owner drivers, that so there isn't this race to the bottom and they're not.
They'll be safe, but they'll be sitting at home on unemployment benefits. That's the whole joke about this. I mean, this is like the old Industrial Relations Commission, where you had a group of people who've never had anything to do with the trucking business, labour lawyers, trade unions, whatever, making decisions about regulations that should apply to an industry that ends up putting people out of work and doesn't save anyone. I'd like to know how many truckies that drive and end up killing themselves are actually with the owner contractors or with the ordinary truck TWU. I mean, no one's worked that out either. Just putting up wages is not going to make anyone safer. It's just going to put a whole lot of people out of business. And I would recommend that everyone read Grace Collier's piece in The Australian today. Even getting your furniture moved from your house to another location, you come under all these regulations, and if you don't comply with the regulations as a client, and you don't know whether this is a regulated trucker driver driver or not, you can be fined up to $5,400 or $10,800 for not complying with these regulations. I mean, the regulations are mad. And it could be that Malcolm Turnbull's now got himself a nice election campaign issue.
Sarah, one of the examples that is being used to illustrate this is to say you're a truck driver in Canberra. You get a job taking let's say a load of furniture to Sydney. You get paid $2,000 for that. You're in Sydney, you unload it. You now need to get back home to home base in Canberra. And at the moment, your choices are you either say, well, it'll be a minimum $300 or $400, and if nobody's prepared to pay that, you go back. You drive anyway, but you're empty, you get no money at all. That's why they want to be able to say, well, I'll do it for $200, anything to at least cover the cost of fuel.
Well, that's right, and I think what you've explained there, John, is probably what Anne's saying is what is the correlation between, enforcing a minimum wage and safety. I agree safety is the paramount issue here. One question I've had about this all along is I never understood why it was confined to owner-operators and employees from larger companies were exempt. Obviously, we often see different policies applied to small business owners and big companies, but it seems to me that this was doomed from the outset if there was going to be a double standard. In terms of safety, I think a lot of us on the road feel that it's the big companies that obviously have a lot of issues that could be addressed. So I think whatever happens here, and it looks almost certain that it's going to be scrapped, that it would be good that it was revisited across the whole industry. I don't think this divide between owner-operators and the big trucking giants is helping anyone.
Toby, there seem to be some very genuine and reasonable concerns on both sides of this, but there's also this sense that it is very much a proxy battle between the unions and some of the owner-drivers, small business people. It's a conflict we see often. And then, of course, there's the wider political stoush that's now been amplified by the fact this is not being put off until after the election. They're going to bring it on next week.
Exactly right. I mean, this isn't about safety. This is about getting truck drivers to join a union. That's the thing at the baseline here. That owner-operators will be forced out of business. Then the larger companies will buy their own trucks and hire them as employees and put them in the union. That's the underlying thing here. There is no difference in the safety of a truck driver in a large company or as an owner-operator. Truck drivers overall, I think, are 12 times more likely to have an accident than another driver on the road. That's a stat I've read. But there's no difference between owner-operators and big companies. This is a scam to get people to join unions.
Jamila, of course, the example I gave, and I guess perhaps we naturally sort of think in terms of long-haul truck drivers, but this particular tribunal also sets rates of pay for people that might be in security vans or short haul or other people that are delivering to ports and so on from rail terminals. So it's a very broad industry. Are we in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here if we say that we can just get rid of an entire tribunal over one pay ruling?
Look, I think we are, and in the end I think this is all about balance and getting that balance right between having that incentive for the market to be able to keep doing what it should do and making sure that goods are being moved around Australia in the way we need them to, and of course safety and making sure that remuneration is fair. And I think even Bill Shorten himself has sort of said, look, this most recent ruling of the tribunal, maybe we need to look at a bit of a slower implementation for that. And for me, that's a signal from him saying, oh, maybe they haven't quite got the balance right on this occasion. But ultimately, this is politics, pure and simple. I mean, for Turnbull, this is a great election issue for him. He wants the spotlight on Shorten and the union movement, and this is another way for him to do that.
Well, let's have a look at another one of the major political battlefields that's emerged today. The banking industry has really refused to rule out a major advertising campaign against Labor's proposed Royal Commission into the finance sector. The Bankers Association says that while it's not actively being planned at this point, a mining tax-style campaign against the Labor policy is on the table. That campaign, of course, you'll recall, back in 2010 cost $22 million and it helped to force Labor into a minority government position. That's cheap compared to the estimated $250 million cost of a Royal Commission to the banks, as well as the $50+ million direct cost to the taxpayers. Now, Toby, you've worked on plenty of election and other campaigns. You've worked for the Howard government as well. What sort of a campaign could you imagine the banks mounting on this?
Well, first they'd have to spend about 20 million bucks, which is probably a tenth of what they'd spend responding to an unnecessary Royal Commission. I always think good campaigns are based in truth, and there are a few essential truths here. Number one, the Royal Commission would have very few powers that are not available through ASIC and APRA and so on. Number two, this is playing politics. Bill Shorten in the post-Abbott era has seen his popularity very low. He's about as popular as herpes at the moment, and he is trying to lift his popularity with using that old Persian proverb, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he's attacking the banks whom people dislike in order to get people to like him. And I think people know that and understand that. I think people also know it can damage our economy, but more importantly, the money, the 200 million that the banks will spend, doesn't just evaporate, it goes somewhere. And where that's going to go is off dividends to shareholders and onto people's mortgages. And that would be the guts of a campaign that I'd run were I doing it. I'd be explaining that it's a very expensive thing, that it's a political stunt that's going to make your home loan rates higher.
Well, let's look at how the mining industry very successfully pointed out the hip pocket effect on all of us from the mining tax back in 2010. Here's a clip.
Well, you're gonna get whacked.
It could be your job.
You're gonna get whacked.
Or your superannuation.
You're gonna get whacked
Or your electricity bill.
by the mining tax.
The extra mining tax is going to affect Australians.
Now, Toby, I mean, I guess that was obviously a very effective campaign at the time, but could the banks mount something like that? I mean, essentially, a lot of consumers, grumble about their banks, and if you suggest that the banks would just be passing on the costs, wouldn't they just think the banks are bigger bastards than they were before?
Well, you're not going to make banks popular. People dislike banks, but they despise politicians. It's a question of passing the parcel. At the moment, Labor's getting a free kick by saying, aren't banks terrible, let's have a lash at them, and people are nodding their heads. If the banks hit back and say, no, actually aren't politicians dreadful because they're whipping this up and they're going to push up your home loan rates in consequence of it, they'd do well, particularly if they ran it out on a marginal seat by marginal seat basis. It would have a real vote impact.
Sarah, do you think that this would be effective if it happens?
Well, I mean, obviously Toby makes some extremely compelling points, which is, on the face of it, the mining tax and a Royal Commission against the bank. For Heartland Australia, it's really a no-brainer. Banks aren't popular, and the mining tax should actually have sailed with mainstream Australia, and yet it didn't, because we've seen this happen so many times. John Howard was a master of it, of course, when he took on Mark Latham in the 2004 election campaign. He kept talking about mortgages and interest rates, and then we saw that sort of language really used against him with the anti-work choices campaign in 2007, where you're bringing these issues back to the hip pocket for voters, and nothing cuts through all the hyperbole like that. But I think, and I'm interested what Toby thinks about this, is that I'm not sure that a scare campaign can work twice. You know, I'm an unfashionable Republican, for instance, and we all know that the monarchists ran a very effective scare campaign against the push for a republic in the referendum in 1999. I don't think that would work again. I think when it does go to a referendum, it
I'm
will
a Republican
get through.
too, but I think scare campaigns work if they have truth in them. And you didn't need a scare campaign back in the days of Ben Chifley, who tried to nationalise the banks in 47. It went on into the courts right into 49. What scared people in the end was that he was undermining the banking system. And it doesn't take much to show people what this kind of Royal Commission would do. It would be like ICAC in New South Wales. It would hold a whole lot of people up and ruin their reputations, ruin our reputation across the world in banking. It would, again, affect all of our investments, including our own personal investments, and in the end it won't be able to do anything.
Toby, how big would that grain of truth that Anne talks about have to be? How powerful is advertising when you've got maybe $20 million to spend?
It's quite powerful during an election campaign. It could certainly make a strong difference of several points in several marginal seats, and that should be enough to change it. Look, fundamentally, if this is political opportunism by Labor, which I believe it is, If it's left unchallenged, they'll win the day. If they challenge it, the banks will win the day. It's as simple as that.
Do you
yes,
think,
advertising
Jamila,
can work.
Yeah, Jamila in Melbourne, do you think that this is going to end up being a net positive or negative for Labor siding with people and very much against the banks?
Oh, look, I think it will definitely be a net positive for Labor. I think the banks don't have that preparation time that the mining industry had in terms of bringing together a lot of players with the money to make this campaign happen. We're likely to be on an election footing, if we're not really already, in a few weeks. So I think there's a different sense there. As well, with the anti-mining tax campaign, there was a very clear bad guy. There was a very clear, this is what we're against. Here is this tax, we're against that. I think it's a much harder campaign to run to say we're against a Royal Commission looking into whether we're doing something naughty. It's much easier to say we are against a particular policy. So I think it'll be tougher for the banks to get the creatives right.
Yeah, Toby, do you think that it's easier to sell people on the idea that any tax is a negative because instinctively we as consumers don't tend to like taxation, so we can relate to that as a personal impact, whereas a Royal Commission into a bank, well, that can only be good for me as a consumer, can't it?
Well, unless it pushes up your home loan rates, which is the argument I'd make. People always say, what's in it for me, or where do I lose? And that's where a campaign would have to head. I would argue, were I doing the campaign, I would argue that this will push up your home loan interest rates. That's what Labor are doing to you by calling for this irresponsible commission.
And these kind of campaigns, how powerful are they in the imagining as opposed to the reality? I mean, sometimes these things, they're a threat that never gets delivered.
Yeah, look, very often campaigns I'm involved in campaigns of this nature. Not infrequently, I develop up campaigns, I test them, I do extensive message testing, I develop up TV commercials, billboards, radio, social media, all of that, expose it to consumers in marginal seats, conduct quantitative research and see what it does to the vote, and then brief politicians on the outcome of that. You'd be surprised how that can persuade people to change their point of view fairly rapidly. If they've got an ill-considered policy, they think, oh, this actually does have consequences if someone bites back.
So do you think that Labor will be rethinking their strategy, or have they already committed to this particular course of action?
It depends if the banks decide to challenge them on it. If the banks challenge them in a straightforward way, more in sorrow than anger, then Labor would actively have to think about it.
All right, now, panellists, we've got a lightning round for you. Quick yes or no answers. Now, Sarah, would you climb Uluru?
No, I wouldn't. The local people have made it very clear they consider it disrespectful, that they've asked us not to climb, and I would honour that.
Anne Henderson.
Never. I couldn't take the vertigo.
So you wouldn't do it for reasons of cultural sensitivity?
Yeah, well, look, if it became an issue, I would probably go with the cultural sensitivity. But to be honest, I wouldn't do it anyway.
How about you, Jamila? Would you climb Uluru?
No, I absolutely wouldn't.
Yeah, let's look at I guess some of the deeper issues here, because traditional owners of Uluru are expressing their upset at the situation now, because there were previously indications that perhaps we'd be working towards a ban on people climbing this world famous monolith. Now, the Turnbull government has indicated that they will in fact be sticking with the current policy, which is not to ban it. There are signs up around Uluru suggesting people should please not walk on it, but it is not illegal. It hasn't been outlawed at all. Now, this is something, Toby, that I guess, it comes down to a question of, do you want to experience this natural wonder in its fullness yourself, or do you defer to the wishes of the traditional owners? On which side do you fall?
Look, personally, I'd respect the wishes of the traditional owners, but I'd have to say that respect is something that is earned rather than something you can mandate. And further, I'd ask the question, how do these lights work? Further, I'd ask the question, if this belonged to the Scientologists, would I pay the same respect to it? If this belonged to the Mormons, would I pay the same respect to it? Why is it that I'm respecting another set of beliefs? I actually don't believe rational decisions should be based on the daft autopilot of divine instruction.
Yeah, Jamila, I mean, that's an interesting point that Toby raises from the, the occasional darkness.
Yeah, I would say it's also a rather offensive point. And it's a shame we don't have an Indigenous person on the panel tonight to be able to weigh in, because I'm very much trying to be a mouthpiece here about something that I don't understand. And that's the whole point. I don't understand the culture here. I don't understand why this particular site is sacred. But from my perspective, when it's your house, you get to make the rules. And Indigenous owners have a relationship with this part of land and this very special piece of land that is much more than the rest of us looking at it and going, that's really cool, look at the great sunset. And I think when it's your house, it's your rules, the same way that we expect if you're in a church, you abide by the religious and spiritual beliefs of the owners of the church, the same in a mosque. And I think you should be respectful. And I think it's not just about earning respect. It's about saying this culture has existed for 40, 50,000 years, and maybe we can be respectful because we're guests in their home as well.
There's just one point with one of the replies to an article today that the rock's been there for billions of years. So who owns the rock? And I think that could be an argument for a lot of Australians. I'm not saying that I do what I wasn't asked to do, was asked not to do, but I think an awful lot of Australians don't regard the rock as particularly belonging to Indigenous people, since the rock has been there since before man began. So that's one person's view.
What if people said, well, look, we want to abseil where St Mary's Cathedral happens to be?
Well, St Mary's Cathedral was built by Catholics in the 19th century. It has a finite beginning. The rock goes back for millennia, and I don't know what the answer is. All I would do, in my case, would be respect those who spend most of their time there and see it as their sacred symbol. But I can see why a lot of Australians, and maybe that's what the Prime Minister's thinking, don't want, as we heard, it mandated, but we want something where we get an agreement. You know, maybe we don't go up the rock so far, or maybe people are allowed to do certain things at the rock, or maybe we just clearly distinguish who has the right to say how the rock's used.
I mean, on that question of, you know, if this were to come at a cost, Sarah, if 10% of tourism was lost, we know that 20% of people that go to the rock still climb it, according to recent data. If when you then have to say, well, do we look at the income generated by that tourism as and the benefit it can be put to the traditional owners, compared to the sensitivities that as I understand it, a lot of the male rituals centre around this rock.
Well, look, my gut instinct is to say no, this can't be dictated to by the tourism dollar, but that's easy for me to say. I don't condone it, a ban on it, any more than I don't think it should be illegal that you abseil down the side of St Mary's Cathedral. But as someone that's fairly critical of the Catholic Church, I also think it's incumbent on us to have a little bit of respect that people who believe in the beliefs espoused within that cathedral would take offence to me casually abseiling down. So I think it comes down to how we communicate this issue, that it is considered disrespectful to the traditional owners. Now, as you said, John, in the introduction, there are signs everywhere. But I can't help but think that it's a lot of international ignorance about it. I mean, for instance, when you're at an Australian airport, I was at Sydney Airport early this year flying interstate, and they still call it Ayers Rock on all of the departure boards. Now, most Australians call it Uluru, and we have done so for well over 20 years now. So the fact that it still doesn't seem to be known as Uluru internationally suggests to me that the spiritual significance of the landmark has been lost. And maybe, when we're paying to have Oprah Winfrey come out and sit down with Hugh Jackman, maybe he could just have a little quick chat to everyone around the world of why it's so important that you perhaps consider not climbing the rock.
So just finally, Toby, I think we've put a few extra coins in the meter there, and we've got your lights back on the Gold Coast. This idea that you can't impose cultural sensitivity, that it's something that people need to arrive at themselves, or not, as the case may be.
Yes, I heartily agree with that. It's only about 20% of visitors who do climb the rock, and it's declining year on year, like smoking. But I think it's wrong to impose it on people.
All right, Telstra is under fire today for backing away from its campaign supporting marriage equality. The Catholic Church informed Telstra that they had, quote, grave concerns about their endorsement of gay marriage, and reminded the telco that they did a lot of business with them. Telstra says that while its position on marriage equality has not changed, they say what has changed is the government has now decided to hold a plebiscite. And now the telco says that they have, quote, no further plans to be active active in this debate. Now, Jamila, on social media, this is being, Telstra's getting beaten around the head, certainly by those in favour of marriage equality over this, that it makes them look cynical in their support for it or gutless now. What's your take?
Yeah, they are getting beaten around on social media, and to be honest, I think it's been a really bad PR call as well as a bad moral call by Telstra. They decided to come out and take a stand on this issue, and they've now backed away after some pressure from the Catholic Church. I think that's a real shame. I think the story was broken by Rick Morton in The Australian this morning, and he pointed out the fact that where are people going to go if you've got the Catholic Church coming in there and saying, Telstra, we won't do business with you anymore? Well, Optus sponsored the Mardi Gras this year. Virgin were also on that list, and so were Vodafone. So I think our telecommunications companies have pretty much been of a consensus that marriage equality is a good thing. So I think it's either like don't use the telephone or get on board.
And should Telstra have never gotten involved with this in the first place, or should they have stuck to their guns?
I think business should look at what's in the interest of business and leave the advocacy to groups outside of it. They're not in politics if they're sensible. And they're trying to get customers, they're trying to keep their customers.
Hold on a moment, Anne, but what if some of their customers are going to be gay, some of their employees are going to be gay?
But it is the right of any group in the community to say whether they want Telstra or not. And Telstra has to make a choice as to whether it is interested in customers or it's interested in advocacy for gay marriage. So it would have been better if Telstra had just stayed out of it. If they want to get into politics, get into politics. But if they want to be in business, stay in business and don't get involved in politics.
Does this, though, Sarah, run the risk of the Catholic Church looking as though they are imposing their values on a company that has a broad range of clients and potentially is bullying them?
Oh, well, I don't see how else you could interpret it. Then that's exactly what they've done. And I suppose, but what's the fallout for them? A lot of people within the Catholic religion, which I've just confessed, I'm a bit of a critic of all the major religions, including Catholicism. They probably are grateful that they see the church standing up on this issue. My issue with this whole thing is it's just crazy that in 2016 we even need our telcos to have any position on same-sex marriage. I don't necessarily think that they shouldn't get involved in social issues and that their stakeholders don't have a real right, but let's just get this issue over and done with. Let's forget about this plebiscite. Let's just go for it.
30 seconds, Toby Ralph.
Telstra isn't a person. I don't know quite whose opinion they're representing. If you look at the published polls, you've got 70% saying yes to same-sex marriage. You've got 30% saying no. Telstra have got 18 million customers and 40,000 staff. Exactly who are they saying yes for? OK, that's all the time we have for The Drum. Thank you to our panellists tonight, Sarah Le-Marquand, Anne Henderson, Jamila Rivsy and Toby Ralph, who I should mention as well in our earlier context, did do advertising campaigns for the Howard government. We'll see you back here at the same time tomorrow night. Good night.